This is Corinne.
And this is Ayani.
And you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast where we take a semi-scholarly look at why
and how
the sex stuff in media matters.
This episode, we get into the sexy shenanigans of the second season of Hulu's The Great. We had so much to say.
And honestly, they had so much sex.
that we decided to talk about it for not one, but 2 episodes. Bonus!
This time around, we focus on where we find Peter, Catherine, and the Russian court as the season opens on Catherine's chaotic coup. Now that she has Russia, what's she gonna do with it?
If you'd like to join in the conversation and get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at SexLoveLit.
And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
And now, on with the show.
Huzzah!
Huzzah! Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Sex, Love, Literature. We are very excited to talk with you all today, as always. It is December, and to prattle on just a little bit, it's kind of weird. This is my first Texas December, and it's hot. It's hot in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Okay, like you gotta be specific though, because you're in San Antonio.
Yes,
and
I'm
different
in San
parts of
Antonio.
Texas have very different Decembers.
That is very fair. Texas is very, very big. It is very large, and we are pretty close to Mexico. But it's like the real feel yesterday high was 83, and like even compared to the winter in Florida, it feels so much hotter than it did when I was there. So I'm a little thrown.
For listeners who don't know, I'm from Dallas, so I have a lot of Texas winter experience, at least there. So what I will tell you, and granted, you're further south than I was, but I very vividly remember, so you get a lot of yo-yoing temperature-wise. So like I vividly remember we had one Monday where the high was 85, and then the next day the low was in the 20s.
Oh, I hate that.
And we had like the coldest weather like that winter that week. Like people were like sitting on the lawn in front of Dallas Hall at my undergrad alma mater and like on picnic blankets, like sunbathing. And then the next day, like everything was covered in ice. So
oh my God. That's how I get sick. When the temperature goes up and down, then I'm laid out for like a week. So looking forward to that, I suppose. But my prattling about the weather and December and Texas aside, this episode, we are going to be returning to a show that Corinne and I adore and that we did our very, very first SLL episode on, The Great. Hulu's The Great, to be specific. The second season started, or I guess dropped in November. And we thought, since A, we already talked about The Great once, and B, it's one of the non-K-dramas that Corinne is willing to watch, that we would do a show about it. Kind of a reprise of things that we'd thought about in the previous episode, but also thinking more about how the second season is expanding on the characters, playing with the ideas that it established in the first season, and things of that nature.
Also, like, big shout out to everyone who listened to our first episode and kept listening, because I went back and listened to it, and it is extremely chaotic.
Yeah, it's a lot.
We did not yet have any structure that we have now, so if you listen to that and were like, I would like some more of this, A, why? But B, thank you.
No, yeah, we really appreciate you. And also the funny thing is since the season 2 of The Great dropped, our numbers on that episode have been ticking up. And I'm kind of, on one hand, happy that new people are finding us. But on the other hand, I'm kind of like, oh, but that's the one you're listening to. We've grown since then. But yeah, that's part of the reason why we're returning to The Great, to think a bit more about it, to, I guess, I don't know, rebuild our egos. From the first episode.
I don't really think
I'm
an ego
kidding.
thing. Okay.
I'm kidding. Just jokes.
How about ethos rather than ego?
Oh, there we go. Another good E word. Rebuilding our ethos. See, this is why you're on the podcast, Corinne.
But anyway, speaking of structure that we have now that we didn't before, Ayani, what is sparking joy for you this week? So really quickly, What's Sparking Joy is a quick segment where we talk about something we are currently reading, watching, or listening to, just to talk about it for fun. So Ayani, what is sparking joy?
What is sparking joy for me? Well, I have a couple things, as often is the case. The first is the Netflix series based on the video game League of Legends, Arcane, which was fantastic. I saw a lot of people online talking about it, and I was a little skeptical. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I was very into some of the League of Legends like music videos that came out a little while ago, but I don't play that game. I don't know too much about it. The character design looks great. I was like, all right, I'll check it out. So Andrew and I watched it together, and holy hell, was it fantastic. The animation was stunning. The story was well put together. I felt a range of emotions. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the way that while the backgrounds and the characters and everything were 3D animated, all of the effects were in 2D, and it gave a really interesting kind of tangible material quality to the work that I wasn't expecting. So Arcane sparked a lot of joy. I'm very excited that there is going to be a season 2. I also want to mention that I think right now, while we're recording, animation workers are angling to get paid more money. And one of the series that they're pointing to is how fabulous and fantastic Arcane was, but how much people actually made while working on it. So I do want to throw a shout out to support our animation workers because they do fantastic work and they should be paid for the work that they're doing. Another thing that's really sparking joy for me that I just started, I want to say yesterday or the day before, was Doom at Your Service, which is a K-drama that Corinne put me onto. The first episode hit me like a ton of bricks.
It's one of my favorite first episodes.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil too much about it, but pretty much what the premise is there's a young woman who finds out she's dying. And the day that she finds out that she's dying, her world just kind of unravels and falls apart.
I don't think it's that much of a spoiler to say that she specifically has a brain tumor because she finds that out in like the first 10 seconds.
Yes, so she has a brain tumor that is pretty much going to be fatal regardless of what she does. So pretty much it's like if you do nothing, you live for 3 months. If you do a biopsy and potentially an operation, you could live for a year. So it starts off very heavy, but then her day kind of falls apart and unravels from there. And I think I cried twice, and I text both Corinne and Andrew about how I was falling apart and like the shortness of life and how we have to love one another. So, like,
well, and what's really interesting about that first episode to me is that like even though all everything hits the fan at once, is that she's just kind of like, all right, so I guess this is what's happening now, and she doesn't fall apart, really.
Yeah. No, it was me that fell apart. She actually does a great job of holding it all together. So it's a, what would you say, supernatural romance, fantasy romance story?
Supernatural fantasy, but I would think of it more as a folk tale kind of feeling than like
interesting
high fantasy epic world building. Because
no. It's definitely an urban fantasy story, not like yeah. This is very much taking place, I think, literally at the end of 2020 into 2021. There's no coronavirus. It's not a thing in this story, but it's a modern, current kind of urban fantasy story. So those are the two things that are sparking joy for me. Corinne, what is sparking joy for you?
So the first thing sparking joy, but also fear, is speaking of things that are in conversation with the coronavirus, I'm watching a K-drama called Happiness, which is not very politely named because it is a zombie drama, and the zombies are scary. But there's also like some rom-com tropes going on. So like the main couple has like a marriage of convenience so that they can get an apartment, but also there are zombies. So
that's a lot. I don't know if I could handle that.
I really like it because I really like the actors, but I really dislike the zombies. So I'm not really sure why I'm still watching it, but I am. And then I just occasionally text Andrew, Ayani's spouse, fucking zombies every time they freak me out, which is very often. Because Andrew was like on a crusade to make me watch Train to Busan, which I will not do. So
Andrew, you heard it here first, or second or third, because she says it
he's
often.
he's heard
But
this like 50 times. I'm not doing it. But anyway, Happiness, I recommend it if you like zombies, or maybe even if you don't, because the Marriage of Convenience is really doing it for me. And then the next thing that is currently sparking joy is the adaptation of the epic high fantasy series Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan on Amazon Prime. It is a surprise to me how much I like it, because I read the books. I read all of them. I read some of them more than once. It's one of those
Nerd.
series.
I'm just
we have a podcast about literature, but we talk about sex. Who's the nerd here? But
I'm just gonna drink my tea.
But the fantasy series, while I enjoyed it, also has some sort of fundamental flaws for me. And I don't know, you can come for me if you want, but like I'll fight you because I'm right about the way the series treats its female characters, which is not well. But the reason the TV series is sparking joy for me is because it's making a lot of changes that I find very satisfying, and taking these like strong female characters much more seriously than the books ever did. So
yeah, we watched the first episode of that the other day, and it was exciting. I enjoyed it. So I think I'll keep watching that as well, and then texting you my feelings about it. My one really random feeling is that, the ceremony, the coming of age ceremony where the women put their long braids in their hair. I was like, man, I don't got enough hair to braid my braid to be like little rat tail.
I mean, if you were like growing up with that as your goal though, then you would have like probably not cut your hair since you were like 9.
I mean, that's fair. My hair, honestly, what I'd probably have to do is put locks in, because my hair just doesn't grow that long, and because it likes to contract. You know what I mean? They'd have to like blow dry my hair in order to braid it with any kind of length or sustenance.
But I will also say something that I really like about the show, speaking of, I guess, different hair textures, is that the cast is very, very diverse. So like they did have to think about hair texture of like Egwene and Nynaeve about like what to do with their hair in order for them to do the coming of age braid.
To launch from one kind of fantasy to another, as I said earlier, we are going to be discussing Hulu's The Great Season 2 today. We are right now planning to split our discussion into 2 pieces. So the first half of our discussion is going to think largely about kind of reintroducing the show to you all as listeners, but we're going to stick more to the first half of the show. Is that fair to say, Corinne?
Yeah. So in this 2-part arc on our podcast, we'll talk about sort of the beginning of the show, and then in the second half, we'll talk about where we leave these characters and sort of the second half. But just fair warning, this will not be spoiler free, especially for the events of season 1. We can't talk about season 2 without spoiling season 1.
Yeah.
So this will not be spoiler free, but you could perhaps listen to the first episode without getting end of season spoilers, I think.
Yeah, we'll try to be good about that, but we also make no promises because we are excitable and sometimes things come out. So, very brief kind of reintroduction to the show. Oh, wait, no, I'm not doing that. Corinne, you're doing the very brief reintroduction to the show.
So for those of you who have forgotten, The Great is a genre-bending anti-historical ride through 18th century Russia, following the wildly comedic rise of Catherine the Nothing to Catherine the Great.
Oh,
which
that's
is
amazing.
It's an amazing description. I pulled it from Google, but I think it's a pretty good description of like what is happening, particularly the anti-historical bit.
That's what I was gonna latch onto. I was like, anti-historical is a phrase and fits perfectly with this show.
But so to set you up with where we find them, so at the end of season 1, we left Catherine in her arranged marriage with Peter, deciding Peter sucks, and he sucks in fact so much that she needs to do a coup. So as one does.
It's just what marriage is like. Sometimes you have to do a coup.
But so we start this season with Catherine, played by Elle Fanning, 4 months into her coup against Peter, played by Nicholas Hoult. And also, as a note, the show is created and produced by Tony McNamara. We find this coup happening, and then Catherine wins. And then she has Russia now. So she has to figure out what to do with it.
And a lot of this season is playing with those questions of, okay, what now? What do you do now, Catherine? Because I think not that it's easy to do a coup, right? I've never done it before. I can't speak to its ease. But
I mean, there's a lot of like almost coups. Could have done a coup, would do a coup this season.
Yeah. But it's kind of like, I think it's easy to get people behind we have to overthrow this guy because he's terrible. It's harder to get everyone then aligned on, okay, what do we do now that Russia is ours? And I think that's a lot of what this season is struggling with, or what the characters this season are struggling with. I don't think the show really struggles at all, honestly.
Yeah, I think the show is great.
Yeah, from beginning to end, it's a ride. Do we want to talk a little bit first about, as Corinne puts it, who's in the upside down now because of the flip of power? Or we don't want to talk first about our general impressions of the season?
Maybe let's start with our first impressions, and then we can get into the specifics. So, what were your impressions of the season as a whole, Ayani? Was it what you expected? Did it subvert your expectations? And how did your impression of the sex stuff work?
Yeah, so I think The Great, in a way, kind of exceeded my expectations. I wasn't, and not to hype it up too much, but I will say I wasn't 100% sure what was going to happen this go round and how they could both sustain the kind of madcap energy of the first season, but also sustain my interest with what was happening. So Corinne tells me, from what I understand, that this is based on a theatrical performance, which I did not know. And the second act of the play is many, many years after the coup. So the fact that we are getting this second season only a few short months afterwards, and then are kind of following Catherine through her pregnancy that was unveiled at the end of season 1, it really, I don't want to say subverted my expectations. I feel like that might be a little too it's not quite what I mean, but I think they played around with what viewers of season 1 might be expecting, and kind of built on the foundations of season 1 while giving us a slightly different kind of energy. So thinking about the sex stuff, for example, one of the things that you and I had talked about was that the first season was very much like in your face sex, if that makes sense. It was
writing on shock value, especially at the beginning.
Yeah, it was kind of the shock and awe, but also playing on Catherine's naivete about how sex works. And I think also playing with our expectations as modern viewers of how sex factors into relationships, right?
Well, and especially that we have this, maybe not so much about Russia, but this idea that like in the 18th century, everyone was like very conservative and like very concerned about purity and virginity and didn't have a lot of sex. But like in The Great, everyone has a lot of sex all the time, constantly. Often in public.
Right, in front of everyone, so everyone can watch and see. But I think what the second season does is, rather than having to have this kind of over-the-top rewriting of people's expectations of sex in the court, so to speak, it's not that they weren't using sex for plot, but I think a lot of the sex now is used to move story points forward in a way that feels very deliberate. And a lot of it is still like, not over the top. I don't want to say it's over the top, but like a lot of it is still very like in your face, let's say. But it feels like it's not for the same, like, look, they're having sex kind of a vibe, which neither one of them is better or worse than the other, but it just feels like they're using it to different effect. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm thinking, that I was thinking about with this show. So we were recently on another podcast called Vox Populorum, and that was called Pour Some Sexy on it, about sort of the
Mm-hmm.
sexy genre or the sexy aesthetic. And I don't think we talked about it on that episode,
Mm-mm.
but I feel like The Great, particularly in season 1, made the sex so gratuitous and we're playing with expectations of sex that it was very rarely sexy.
Hmm.
Particularly between Catherine and Peter. I do think Catherine had sexy sex with Leo,
With Leo, yeah, and we talked about that. Mm-hmm.
with like her first love, but there is like a fair bit of sex in the first season of The Great that is deeply unsexy. And I think that we sort of return to or it circles back to having like sexy sex, especially by the end of the season.
Mm.
But we also see a lot of reasons why people like just have sex to have it, or like that there are a lot of different reasons why people
Mm-hmm.
have sex
Mm-hmm.
than romantic love.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things that The Great does well in both seasons is give this kind of spectrum of sex, let's say, because I know
Mm-hmm.
one of the quote unquote kinds of sex that was over the top in the first season was kind of the duty sex. The like, well, we have to make an heir, so you just lay on the
Mm-hmm.
bed there and I'm gonna thrust at you for 100 pumps or whatever.
I forgot that where he was legit counting out
Counting.
loud.
Yeah.
No, and Elizabeth was counting because he lost
Well,
track.
that's right, because they were also in the room. So, the range of kind of, and that was very unsexy. So, like, to your point, unsexy sex. But in this season, I think there's it's similar in that way that there are people having sex and they're kind of like detached from what's happening or trying
Mm-hmm.
different things that may or may not be working for them. So I think there's this, I think both seasons were great at kind of like playing around with that range of sex, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak.
Yeah, but so that's sort of, I guess, do you have any other general first impressions you want to add before we move into the specifics?
One quick thing, and I think that's related to kind of the sex, is there were side characters, I think, this season that got roped into some of the madcap sex stuff happening in this season that were a little bit separate from it. So we got kind of a peek into other people's sexual proclivities and things of that nature. So one that jumps out to me was her doctor. There were so
Mm-hmm.
many moments. What is his name? It's now
Venedal.
my Venedel. Thank you. I was getting stuck on Velamentov. There are so many moments in this where Venedel is like saying things and doing things, and it's like, you a little freaky, aren't you, Venedel? Where it was really brought to the surface in this season. So
Well, and there was a lot of space for that, I think. And so one of the main plot lines of of this season is that Catherine is pregnant. So she has to have
very
like
pregnant.
regular doctor checkups. And she's like getting increasingly round and it looks increasingly uncomfortable. But so there's like a lot more opportunity for Vinodal to like show up and have his crazy input. Like, here, you can do some coke now.
Yeah, Catherine did so many drugs this season. She did coke and she did
Well, she drank a ton of vodka.
Oh yeah, a bunch of vodka, but there were two like sequences of hard drugs that I remember, and one was cocaine, and
She did mushrooms with Archie.
That's what it was. She did mushrooms to see God, as it were.
But all right, so we have this, circling back to where we open on the show, we have this massive power shift in which people who were not in power, so Catherine and her followers, are suddenly in power, and people who were in power, so Peter and his little posse, are suddenly no longer in power and even like locked up in the palace.
That's right. We didn't mention that Peter is under house arrest in the palace. So he's locked in his apartments, as they were. So he has access to his room and the breakfast room, I guess?
Yeah. So but let's maybe start with where we see Catherine and Peter and how this shift in power dynamics affects their relationship. So Catherine
Sure.
did the coup. She did it. And then now Peter is under
Huzzah.
house arrest. Huzzah. I do want to think for a moment. There's this really striking scene at the end of the first episode where Catherine has just like negotiated Peter's surrender, and the deal Peter
Mm-hmm.
makes, instead of taking like exile or anything like that, is to get to see Catherine and Paul, their unborn child, for 20 minutes a day at breakfast. But then he gives Catherine, so Catherine, we see throughout this whole coup, has been looking for the body of Leo, her first lover and her first so-called great love from the first season. And basically the choice she makes at the end of season 1 is she either is going to do this coup and Leo is going to die, or she's going to choose Leo and not do the coup and leave Peter in power. And she decides to Presco, give Velementov the go-ahead. Velementov is her general. And that means that Leo is probably going to die, but she hasn't had
Definitely.
confirmation that he is dead. Like, they can't find the body. And immediately after she negotiates Peter's surrender, he tells her that he has Leo's mummified head.
Oh, God.
And we have this moment where Catherine is holding this bag that is dripping blood that has Leo's head in it. And the soldiers and the army and her followers, so Orlo and Velementov, are like shouting huzzah and like saluting her for the first time as Empress, but she's holding the head of her dead lover. Which is just like, I don't know exactly what I want to say about it, but that image really stuck with me.
Yeah, Catherine really was going through it, I feel like, those first 2 episodes of reconciling the decisions she made with Leo's life, and the way that Peter kind of not even callously, but, like, without regard for the fact that this was a human head, just kind of tossed it in her direction. In a way, I don't know, maybe it felt like for her brought to focus the decision, the finality of the decision that she made, but also the fact that Peter is still terrible, so there was a reason why she did all of this.
Yeah, it was very like, it made it very concrete, the sacrifices that Catherine made
Yes.
in order to do this. Like, there are a lot of ways in which the coup is treated as somewhat casual by a lot of people. Like, their lives haven't necessarily changed in a significant way. Like, for example, like for the serfs and for a number of the more like faceless kinds of nobles. But
Yeah.
like, it made it very concrete that like people died, like a lot of people, because there's a way in which this show is a little bit casual with death, particularly of side characters. But then there are moments where it's like, oh no, when someone dies, like the stakes are still very big, even if they are treated casually by people like Peter sometimes.
Well, see, now here's a question, and we don't have to necessarily get into this, but I'm wondering if the character who is committing the violence, the murdering, the deathing changes how the show takes it into consideration, because I think there is a lot of murder and a lot of dying in this season, but I don't feel like it's often taken as comical, and I think the moments where it is taken as comical, Peter is involved.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a lot of like Peter's doubles dying.
Right. There's a lot of that. And there are quite a few other characters who die that we'll talk about as we're going through. But I feel like the ones that are like, ha ha ha, like with the Peter's doubles, Peter is related versus there's a character who dies that's tied to Muriel, for instance. And I don't think those are at all played for laughs. They're both very serious. So, yeah, but
No, I think that's a good point.
Death is not quite the purview of this podcast, but is very much the purview of the show. So, as you were saying, though, we're kind of in this situation where things are flippy-floppied for a lot of our main cast. So we wanted to give some context as to where people are, how their lives have changed or not changed, and how how they're being reintroduced to us in this second season. So we talked a little bit about where Peter and Catherine are.
Also, just to be clear, Peter still insists that he is madly in love with Catherine, and Catherine is like, absolutely not.
You are not in love with me.
Well, and it's not just that Peter is in love with Catherine. He also is convinced that Catherine is in love with him.
Yes, that it is a reciprocal relationship, so to speak.
So the stakes here are not just Russia. They are also romantic. I don't know. Well, and it's complicated.
That's what I was thinking, but yeah.
They are both big stakes, but in different ways, because Catherine and Peter are so symbolic of Russia itself as like these heads of state. But yeah, anyway, so they both have a lot of followers.
Yes, they both have a lot of followers. But let's start with Catherine's followers, because they are, the cast that's around the main character. So first we have Orlo, who's played by Sasha Dehuam. I put an accent on that I didn't think I needed to, but that's okay. We all know I'm terrible at pronouncing names. But Orlo is in a very interesting place this season, because he started as kind of a, low-level aristocrat, so
he's
to
like
speak.
A low-level bureaucrat, but also... Yeah. So everyone here is an aristocrat, because you have to be in order to have any sort of position at court.
Right.
But so Orlo is sort of a low-level bureaucrat who is smart enough to know what could be happening and has some of the same ideals as Catherine, but is laughed out of the room by Peter on a regular basis, which is what convinces him to take Catherine's side.
Right. And now he is the right-hand man of the queen. So he is now somebody... Oh, the Empress. That's right. Excuse me. The Empress. So now he is somebody who was kind of the laughingstock of the previous court, is someone who has immense amounts of power, but also had quite a bit of trauma the last season. And that is definitely taking its toll on how he is processing things and dealing with things and making suggestions to Catherine. He is definitely, especially at the beginning of the season, a character who likes to make plans. And I don't mean in a plotting sense, but he's somebody who likes to know what is going to happen in the order that it's going to happen. He's not necessarily a character that's going to be like, we're going to do something big and dramatic to make a statement. And that's kind of where the friction comes between Orlo and Catherine this season, is that Catherine wants to make big, grand gestures as Empress because she is the mother of Russia and Russia needs to know how great she is, versus Orlo kind of being like, we have to do things methodically so everything doesn't fall apart. Yeah.
Another fun thing about Orlo is that he is, as someone with higher standing now, starts sort of exploring his sexuality more, which is hilarious. I think he's pretty clearly being placed on the asexual spectrum, and that he like tries to have sex with a woman and then he tries to have sex with a man and it does absolutely nothing for him.
Yeah.
Until he starts having sex with the woman running Catherine's girls' school, and they like talk about intellectual things while they're doing it.
And they make like puns.
And that is like the only way it works for Orlo. So he is, I think, solidly demisexual, which is a really, really interesting commitment for the show to make.
Yeah. But also I kind of enjoy the fact that the school teacher has a book open that she is reading while they're having sex, and they both are like really into this. And I'm like, all right, it takes all types. Good for y'all. I'm glad y'all are happy. I'm glad y'all are happy. So that's kind of where Orlo is at the start of things. Moving on from there, we have Catherine's military commander, Velementov, who's played by Douglas Hodge, who is struggling with his legacy as a military man. And while he was a very important part of Catherine's coup, the coup is really cemented in this first episode of season 2, in part because Catherine chases Peter and his motley crew out of the... It's not a castle. What is it?
I don't know, the capital, the palace.
Out of the palace, thank you. Out of the palace by inventing Molotov cocktails and like hurling them out of the room he's in. So the joke that kind of happens from then is, while Velementov is saying that the coup is part of his great legacy, people are like, yeah, but really Catherine cinched the deal there. What did you really have to do with that? So we start with him kind of being Catherine's left-hand man, but struggling with legacy and what it means for him as a military man to not really have big victories to his name. So that's where his friction comes with Catherine, because Catherine is all about the mind and being cerebral and also not wanting unnecessary death. So
And there's also, so speaking of Velementov's sex life, because that is what we're doing.
I like that I'm providing context, and then you're like, yes, but the sex. Remember what our listeners want, Ayani.
But so Velementov in the first season is played for this sort of drunken buffoon who Peter like calls fatso and has do ridiculous things all the time. So he really can't get anyone to have sex with him. But then in this season, he like, because he's now in this position of power and is also taking himself more seriously, I think, is a lot more like solid and sturdy and reliable for Catherine, at least until he starts having this existential crisis, and also is having like a lot more sex.
A lot of sex. Yep.
But I think he is people, so like for example, Lady Svenska, people are particularly having sex with him in order to gain access to information that he has, and because of his proximity to Catherine.
I felt like that was only Svenska. I felt like the other lady that he was having sex with out in the woods was just into it for him.
That's maybe fair. Also, there was that scene, which was where
I know exactly which one.
Poor Orlo like comes into Velementov's room to get him, and there is a woman underneath of him, and she's like, "I can't help me, I can't get out." And Orlo's like, was this against your will? And she's like, "No, I wanted it, but then he just like passed out, and now I can't get him off of me because he's like a big dude." It's so funny, and also like it's hilarious how the show is like very specific that Velementov was like, it was consensual sex.
Yes,
it just like he just fell asleep.
Oh my god. So as a tiny person, like I totally got that. I was like, sometimes you get stuck. I get it. I totally get it. Oh, but the way that Orlo was like, what is it? They're on our left flank. And Velementov like flipped off of the woman and was ready to fight. That was really funny. But yeah, so Velementov has been out here getting it. And I support that as well. I support him. I'm happy for him. Good for Velementov. But that is also, I was actually really upset about Svenska kind of, what is it? Oh God, it's not, is it honeypotting? Is that what it is? When you like speak with someone and try to get information?
It's a honey trap.
Honey trap.
A honey trap is a little specifically like a spy situation where like I don't know, Velementov should have known. Velementov should have known who Lady Svenska was. He should have known better.
I agree. But also he had shot her husband. So things were complicated between them. But moving on from Velementov, we have Aunt Elizabeth, played by Belinda Bromelo.
So Elizabeth is Peter's aunt, and then loves Catherine like a daughter, I think legitimately, and essentially takes Catherine's side in the coup, but also makes a deal with Catherine for Peter's life.
Yes, she's trying to play both her hands because she cares, for both Peter and Catherine dearly, and
she's also incredibly strategic. It's not just that she emotionally cares about them. She, I think, has this reputation and this persona of being a little bit wild and head in the clouds and like, being very flighty and having a lot of like crazy sex. But also like, she is, I think, one of the smartest, most strategic, most grounded characters at court.
I agree. Though we also get some great moments of her sexual escapades as well. I know
she's so funny.
I know one of our favorites is when she goes to see Peter when he's under house arrest, and the guards are like, "Oh, nobody can come in," and she's like, "Oh, well, if I go in, then that gives you permission to treat me roughly." So you
could drag me to my room and do whatever you want with me.
But then when the guard actually is dragging her to her room, she's like, "No, you're not doing this right." And she just gets off the floor and starts walking. And she's like, "I'll show you how to do it later." And I'm like, Elizabeth, living your best life. But I also think we get to see more of Elizabeth this season and allow and the showrunners allowed a great range of emotion with her,
Mhm.
because one of the through lines of the story is about her son that drowned, Igor, right? Was his
Mhm.
name?
He drowned when he was 6, I believe.
Yeah, he was a wee thing, and she's been beating herself up about it because she let him kind of wander through the forest and then he drowned. So that is a major, major through line through the story, and also that is part of her relationship development with Peter this season. So she had a and remind me, right? She murdered her other son, right? In the first season? Or how did he
That
die?
wasn't her son, but she murdered there was, like, another kid who was, like, a potential heir to the throne that
Who
people
lived in the
could
walls.
who people could have lined up behind to do a coup against Peter. So when he became a threat, I think his name was Ivan, maybe? But
Mhm,
when he
mhm.
became a threat, even though Elizabeth had, like, raised him as her own in a lot of
Ah,
ways,
okay.
she cut his throat because
Okay.
he was a threat now, so that's just the deal.
Got it. I didn't know if Ivan was actually her child or if she had just had a hand in raising him.
I don't remember exactly how he was related to people or how he was an heir to the throne, but he wasn't Elizabeth's child, I don't
Got
think.
it. Got it. So that's where Elizabeth is. Do you wanna pick up with the next kind of characters? Because 'Cause
Yeah, so
I've been doing really good with naming so far, but I don't trust myself.
the next two are kind of in the middle of Catherine and Peter. So the first is Mariel, who was Catherine's serving woman for most of the first season, but had been made a serf by Peter. So her
Mhm.
revenge was to help overthrow him. But then at the 11th hour, she betrays Catherine's plans to Peter in exchange for becoming a lady again. So Mariel, played by Phoebe Fox, is sort of navigating this space where she betrayed Catherine, regrets it, and wants to be Catherine's best friend again, and is functionally because Catherine is wildly forgiving in a way that is not really that strategically sound.
No.
But so Mariel is navigating that, and then Mariel, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Mariel develops a very interesting relationship
Mhm.
and has to navigate the complexities of being a woman and not being allowed to inherit as
Yes.
the season goes on. And the other characters sort of. Oh, did you want to say something?
Well, just really quickly about Mariel, she kind of
Mhm.
contends that part of her betrayal was to save Catherine's life. So it wasn't one of a saying that we say a lot in the house is that people don't only do things for one reason.
Mm.
So I think part of what the show is playing with is the complicated nature of Mariel's betrayal, in that maybe it was on one hand to gain standing, but also she does still care and love Catherine. So it might have also
Mhm.
been to save her life. Like both of those things aren't mutually exclusive, I think, in her betrayal.
That's fair, but I also think Mariel made the coup a lot messier than it would have been otherwise
That is
by
fair,
betraying it to Peter.
but also good for us as viewers. So
Yes.
like, can we really be mad at her for that one?
Also, I will also say that Phoebe Fox's performance is a highlight for me
Yes.
of the first season and now of the second because she's just so wry and sarcastic. And of
You would like the wry sarcastic
course I
character.
do. But she's hilarious. And then the other character sort of trying to make the switch from being a supporter of Peter to a supporter of Catherine is Archie, the archbishop and the patriarch of the church,
Mhm.
played by Adam Godley. And he, I think, is also very smart, but
Mhm.
is not necessarily, well, I mean, clearly was not on Catherine's side,
Nope.
but is able to make the transition from being a supporter of Peter to being at, at least tolerated by Catherine,
Mhm.
to then being a person who Catherine trusts to support her, which is a
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
difficult transition to make, I think.
Yes. And there is a crocodile involved in that transition?
I think it's a gator.
I mean, it is probably a gator, but they called it a
They
crocodile.
did call it a crocodile. I don't know. This is a Florida thing, I think, that we are
Yeah,
very
it is.
invested in the difference between crocodiles and gators. We did the same thing in the Loki show on Disney Plus.
That was actually very funny because it was one Floridian, homegrown Floridian, and 3 Floridian transplants. We were all like, that's a gator. That's a swamp puppy. People are saying Croc Loki. We were like, nope, nope, that's a gator. That's a gator. And we were right. It was a gator. So
So again, I think it was actually a gator, but they called it a crocodile. Anyway, that's beside the point. But Archie also has his own trials and tribulations.
Oh, yeah, he does.
With his own sexuality. But since those occur more in the second half of the show, we will talk about those later.
Yeah, it made me... Archie has always been kind of a weird character for me, not one of my favorites. However, I found... this is going to sound weird, but kind of like his struggles really interesting this season, and it made him someone that I was paying more close attention to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm very wary of relatability as a standard of measure for a character.
Sure.
But there are ways in which Archie became more relatable in trying to do whatever he could. Like once he decided Catherine was best for Russia, or even if not best for Russia, was there to stay, he started trying to do whatever he could to get her to at least start listening to him, which she is absolutely closed off to doing. So much so that so the sequence where Archie in the first episode of the first season is obligated as patriarch of the church to check if Catherine is still a virgin.
Oh boy.
Which is obviously being used for shock value both for the audience and for Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
But he has to make amends for that in this season, and I don't know that he really succeeds, but to do so he tries to he does it by like cutting off one of his so-called offending fingers and giving it to Catherine as a gift. And it is very like, oh buddy, like that's A, not gonna work, but also like B, now your finger's gone.
Yeah. Though funny, the finger ends up with Elizabeth, who makes art out of it. So there's that. But also Archie has a cool kind of like fake finger that he wears for the rest of the season. I thought it was cool anyway.
Also, Archie and Mariel have a very interesting relationship.
They're like cousins, right?
I think they're related somehow, but they're also very good friends.
Yeah.
And like support each other. And like one of the reasons that Mariel betrays Catherine is because Archie convinces her to. Archie convinces her to.
So kind of leading off the betrayal of Catherine, let's poke a little bit about Peter's posse. There's not as many of them, so we'll get through this kind of quickly. But first and foremost, of course, we have George and Grigor. George played by Charity Wakefield and Grigor played by Gwilym Lee. So they have...
to be clear, George is a woman.
Yes, Georgina is her full name. Mm-hmm. George is what they call her in the show, which honestly I always liked. I think George is a great nickname for Georgina. Mm-hmm. But in the first season, Grigor and Georgina are Peter's like ride or die crew. Peter and George have sex constantly all the time, which Grigor just has to deal with, which is a thing. But this season, George asks Catherine to exile her and Grigor to France because she kind of sees the way the wind is blowing.
Yeah, George is one of the smartest. She's one of the smartest people in Peter's little stupid team.
Yes, she is. She is.
Like, I think she specifically has a moment where she's trying to get them to think strategically about how to undermine Catherine's rule, and they just keep getting distracted by other shit, and she's finally like, fuck, I give up. Mm-hmm. And, like, that's when she decides, like, I cannot do this with these people. I am leaving. Goodbye.
Pretty much. And she gets Catherine to exile her to France. She was going to bring Grigor with her. However, he cannot leave Peter. And what's really interesting about that dynamic is by removing George from the court, by removing her from the palace, Grigor really starts to develop as a character. I think he moves into being a little bit more of the mastermind in Peter's court, but also develops an interesting relationship with one of the other characters. I mean, that starts before the second half, right?
Yeah, we can talk about
Okay,
it.
so he starts developing an interesting relationship with Mariel, which then creates kind of this like I don't want to say conflict of interest for both of them, but their loyalties are split,
Yeah,
right?
it's both a bridge and a conflict of interest because
Yeah.
Mariel supports Catherine, Grigor supports Peter. They are not really supposed to talk about it, but they also do have a sort of developing emotional intimacy.
Yes. Yeah, it's complicated, and part of what's interesting about it is they both lost their virginities to each other, which apparently was a thorn in George's side also for a very long time.
Hmm.
So there's this interesting kind of connection between the two of them that is built in this season, and that I personally found interesting and endearing as kind of like our B couple plot, if that's fair to say. If Peter and
Yeah,
Catherine are the A couple plot, then I think Mariel and Grigor were the B couple plot. And then along with them, we also have Arcady and Tatiana, who are two kind of members of Peter's crew. We're not going to be talking a lot about them, but one of the things that's very funny is like Tatiana ramps up her desire to sleep with Peter this season and is like
hmm,
very, very obvious about it, including putting her boobs in an icebox at one point.
yeah. But so she's trying to fill this void that George has left by going to France in Peter's life. But I think maybe we can use this as a moment to transition into talking about Catherine and Peter's developing relationship,
Mm,
at least as it
mhm, mhm.
starts, because I was thinking when they sent George to France that it was because the actress wanted to leave the show.
Oh, I thought so too. I thought so too.
But having now seen the whole season and thinking about it more holistically, I think George had to leave in order to make space in Peter's life for Catherine.
Yep. Mhm. Mhm. Because George as a character takes up a lot of space both for Peter and for Grigor. In part because she is one of the smartest characters in the show, so a lot of how she's moving through things is playing other characters, if that makes sense. So removing her from the stage allows these characters to breathe and think about things in a different kind of way that I agree I
Mhm.
don't think would have been possible if she was there.
Well, because like thinking about it, Peter, particularly in the first season, has a lot of sex and with a lot of different people, and not
Uh-huh.
just like penetrative sex, but like he goes down on a lot of people. He like he's just a very promiscuous person.
Yep. There's a lot of all the kinds of the sex. Yes.
So the one of the central conflicts, aside from the whole Russia business, is Peter is in love with Catherine. Catherine hates Peter.
Mhm.
So Peter is trying to get Catherine to fall in love with him. And
Right.
spoiler, he kind of succeeds. But I don't think he would
It
have
was
been
a ride.
it is a ride, and it is insane to me that I was convinced by it, but I
Yep.
absolutely was.
Yep.
But like I do not think Catherine can love someone who does not have some degree of fidelity to her because of
Yeah.
how romantic her view of romantic love is.
Mhm. 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 So removing Georgia from the equation is kind of allowing that to have its space to grow.
Mhm.
Something that's also really interesting, again, that the show does that I am shocked that this worked, but it seems like Peter is trying to be a better person and
Mhm.
balance some of his more violent impulses, let's say,
As
and some of
Catherine
his
calls it, his mercurial violence.
yeah, and this kind of uh open promiscuous nature with some of the things that Catherine cares about. So like he starts learning French, he starts doing kung fu and meditating and like learning about astronomy. And
I do really appreciate it that Peter's version of becoming a better person is partially influenced by what he thinks Catherine would like, but also just partially influenced by his own weird proclivities, like
yes.
especially the kung fu stuff.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And also Elizabeth kind of has her hand there being like,
Mhm.
if you want Catherine to realize that she loves you, like obviously she does, um, these are some things that you can do. So
Also, side note, that is also for Elizabeth motivated by keeping their bloodline on the throne because she is
yes.
very aware And the show is very aware and makes the audience aware of how dangerous being pregnant is.
Mm,
And
mhm,
there's no
mhm,
guarantee of Catherine's survival. There's even less guarantee of her child's survival and that she'll be able to carry the pregnancy to term. So Elizabeth
mhm,
is very
mhm.
aware that, like, if Catherine miscarries, that's it for their bloodline, unless Peter can convince Catherine not only to let him stick around, but to let him get her pregnant again.
Right, to have more children, right. So, Peter, over the course of this season, goes a long way from being, this man who would toss Catherine's lover's head to her in a bag, sopping with blood, to being someone who you actually believe might have some empathy and sympathy for other human beings. And
Mhm.
I think the writing team and the rest of the showrunners do a great job of actually making that happen, because I didn't think I would be convinced. I didn't think that I would believe it, but through some of the conversation that Peter and Catherine have and how clear it becomes that they understand each other in a way that other characters don't, I
Mhm.
kind of bought into it.
Although I also think, thinking about it, it's not just that Peter is becoming a better person, it is also that Catherine is honestly in some ways becoming a worse person, or it is becoming more
Mm.
clear the ways that Catherine is not necessarily a really that great of a person either.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Do you wanna speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's like, I'm thinking of a particular moment after Catherine has increased Peter's house arrest to like complete isolation, and then even puts like the mummified corpse of his mother in the room
God,
with him, which is horror. And Peter
terrible.
starts losing his dang mind, because anyone would lose their dang mind in that situation. So I think there's, and this is also after she had the guards like kick the shit out of him.
Yeah, that's the only way to describe it. They, like, kicked the shit out of him.
So he's injured alone with his mother's corpse, and then he sees like out the window that Grigor and George are leaving for France, so his best friends are gone, and Peter is like, when she comes back in and finally feels bad for what she's done, he is sitting on the floor with like his mother's body in pieces, trying to put her skeleton back together.
Oh, and it keeps crumbling apart in his hands and breaking. Oof.
It is, I mean, honestly, I think part of the reason that part of the way that they get us at least marginally on Peter's side is by seeing how absolutely shittily Catherine is treating him.
Yeah.
Like
Sympathy for the devil, so to speak.
it's hard, it's impossible honestly not to feel bad for Peter in that moment, even knowing all of the bad things that Peter has done. But he
Yeah.
like is so convinced that Catherine loves him, and I think he's right. But that like he says something about, oh, like that's one of the thing I love about you, like, is your ruthlessness. And she's like, I'm not ruthless. And it's like, you are though. Like, seeing what you did to Peter just now,
Yeah.
like, so they have these traits that are really similar but
Mhm.
manifest in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
So like Peter will do more like obvious, that man called me a dickhead, I will stab him kind of violence.
Well,
but
he called him a dickhead, like, you
but
have to
yeah,
do it.
but Catherine's ruthlessness manifests in different ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I found that sort of resonance very compelling and very
Mm.
interesting in both working to at least partially redeem Peter, but also make it clear that Catherine isn't, she may be enlightened, but she's still a despot, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it also kind of highlights some of the other things that rupture in her relationships over the course of this season. If season 1 was the building up of these relationships, season 2 is how a lot of them fall apart and have to be
Hmm.
rebuilt.
Yeah, when they no longer have this common goal of putting Catherine on the throne and have these different goals of what they want to do now that she's there, things start to fall apart.
So that actually sounds like a good place to wrap up this first half of our discussion of The Great, which, looking at our timer, I'm glad that we decided to do 2 halves of this, because this would have been like a 2-hour episode. But next time, what we're going to be thinking a lot about are how these specific relationships develop over the second half of this show. So really thinking about how Catherine and Peter go from enemies to lovers by the end of the season, but also how that gets complicated.
It really is enemies to lovers gold, I think.
So if that's your trope, if that's your bag, then 100% The Great is for you. But also thinking a little bit about how the show plays with first love tropes. With Corinne and I have a lot of feelings about thinking a little bit about Mariel's situation, which was a whole can of worms, but also an interesting character that comes into play is Catherine's mother, and she shakes up the court. Yeah, she shakes up the court a lot, so I know we're going to spend some time talking about that. So to wrap up here, this was fun. I can't wait to keep talking about The Great in part 2 of our, what did you call it, mini arc episode?
Yes. Our mini series.
Our duology.
Our
duology. Oh my gosh. Yes. That's going in the episode description. So to kind of do our normal kind of closing stuff, Corinne, what do we have coming up? Or actually, what are just some interesting things that are out there that people might want to know about sex love literature?
So we do have coming up part 2 of our discussion of The Great.
No shit.
But like I mentioned, we also were guests on the delightful academic podcast, academic podcast with much chaos. So it's called Vox Popularum. They're very fun. Their vibe is the conversation in the bar after the conference. It is much chaos, much fun. We talk a lot about polyamory. I don't know. That's just kind of how that happened. And we also have an episode coming up, or which may have already dropped, I don't know, depending on our editing order, in which Leah from the wonderful K-drama podcast Afternoon of Delight will be joining us to talk about love triangles, because in addition to being a K-drama addict like me, she's also a romance author.
So those are some exciting things we have coming up for you as we wrap up, I guess, the 2021 sprint of sex love literature, which is very exciting.
You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at SexLoveLit, all in one word. Please follow us, subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and give us a rating if you feel so inclined, because if we get good ratings, it really does help other people to find us.
Yes, 5 stars if you're, so inclined. So I believe we'll probably drop episode 1 of this and episode 2 around the same time. So what are you waiting for? Go and listen to episode 2. We'll be there waiting for you.
Bye.
Bye.